Okay, so welcome back to this week, or if you're jumping ahead, I guess welcome back to the same day. But this week we are going to be going over Chapter 3, which is personality assessment. We're going to talk a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about the nature of personality assessments. We're going to talk about whether personality tests use self data or behavioral data. Also, just to give a sense of what are the types of different tests, so whether that's projective tests or objective tests, and what the difference between those are. And we'll discuss how we go about, especially with the objective test, the construction of it. So, what exactly goes into creating good questions or kind of patterns that allow us to get a sense of somebody's personality. And we'll discuss significance testing and effect size, so that way we can figure out, okay, is this a good question on a personality inventory or not? I say personality inventory or assessment. It's kind of interchangeable. If you hear me say assessment or inventory, just know that those are the exact same things. And then lastly, we're going to discuss the replicability, so the ability to get the same result over and over again, and also some ethical considerations for assessments in general. So, real quick, personality is basically the definition is kind of a pattern of behavior, right? And so we have different motivations and we have different intentions and goals and strategies, and everybody has different ones, right? One person's motive for going to school might be because they want to make their parents proud, while the other is like, I want a good job, or one is just about, I just want to know more, right? So we have different motivations and different desires and different goals with what we're doing. And so that kind of all of these little motivations and strategies for getting and achieving those things kind of all tie into who you are as a person and the construct that you have about the world. So what we want to do is we want to be able to look at personality and find these tests that allow us to get to the bottom of some of those intentions and motivations and behaviors that we often see each other doing. And so we want to get well validated tests that allow us to do that. However, unfortunately, there are lots of fraudulent tests when it comes to personality inventories. I mean, some some of them are very hard to distinguish, and it would be difficult where you need to actually look at the questions in a more scientific way. Some of them are probably a little bit easier for you. Sorry, some of them might be a little bit easier for you to figure out. Like if you're going to BuzzFeed and taking what Star Wars character am I? And you're like, oh, I'm Anakin Skywalker. It's like, okay, sure. But that's fun and dandy, but realistically, that's more of like for fun, not really. Maybe it gets to somewhat of a sense of who your personality is, but it's not as stringently looked at as others. So, the most widely used ones are going to be like the MMPI, which is the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, and like its name, it was developed in Minnesota. And it's designed mainly for clinical settings. But it's also used in other settings. Other really common ones is like the California Psychological Inventory, or the CPI, and that's kind of designed for individuals without disorders. A common one that you might see more outside of the clinical setting, but more in kind of like a business setting, is the HPI, which is the Hogan Personality Inventory. And a lot of employers will use this for personnel selection. So if you've ever been like gone through a hiring process for some like FBI or CIA kind of jobs, a lot of times they might give you an HPI. Now, these types of inventories are called omnibus inventories. And omnibus basically means that they're looking at multiple range, or a large range of traits. So they're looking at multiple traits. Some inventories might just be focused on one trait. So maybe there's inventories that look specifically at introversion, or how introverted you are, or extroverted, right? So where that's like kind of in the same trait. It's how social you are, right? So there's some that just look at one trait. Omnibus inventories, though, are going to look at multiple traits. Now, some of them, in fact, most of them are going to have S data, which, again, if you remember from last week, it's self data, right? It's that self-disclosed data. So it's you answering questions about you, right? Or me answering questions about me. But some of these tests also provide B data. If you remember, B data is behavioral data, and so that's things like the MMPI. Again, that's the Minnesota Multifacet Personality Inventory that will include behavioral data. So if you've ever taken an MMPI or an intelligence test for that matter, you might notice that when you take the test, it's not like they just give it to you and you fill it out and then you return it and they look it over. It's actually where you take it, and usually you're in front of somebody while you're taking it. And the reason that you're doing it in front of them is for a couple of reasons. One, it's to protect the intellectual property of the test, so that way you don't just like take it with you and show everybody, and then now we can't really get a firm grasp of somebody that you've shown who comes in. But also because they're observing you and figuring out how you are answering and what kind of things. Do you need a lot of breaks during these tests, or do you need are you kind of unclear about something and you're constantly asking questions? Are you fidgety? Are you're doing a lot of actions during these? And so they're looking at how are you when you're taking these as well. Now, there's a few different types of personality tests. Now, the first one we're going to discuss is called a projective test. And this is kind of based in psychoanalytic theories, of this very Freudian type of thought process. I say Freudian, but it's kind of like rooted in Freud's psychoanalysis. Now, what it's based on is the theory that we have these unconscious mechanisms. So these mechanisms that we are not consciously aware of, right? And the test is we present kind of ambiguous stimuli, and it asks basically a person to describe what they are seeing right there. And the idea there is, again, you're trying to figure out what their thought process is. Is there any hidden aspects to their mind that we're not aware of, or that can be kind of uncovered through these ambiguous stimuli? So probably the most common one would probably be the Rorschach or the Inkblot test. And a lot of people have, if they've ever think of like a test that a psychologist would give, this is probably the main one that people think of. So the Rorschach is one type of projective test. Draw a person is where they, just so for some extra context, Inkblot I'm going to show you in just a second, but basically they take ink, they put it on a piece of paper, they basically fold that paper in half, and then they ask the person to tell them exactly what they're seeing. And that's one type. Draw a person is basically where they go and they ask a person, hey, draw a person. And so the person draws a person, and based on what they see, their interpretation is based off of like what kind of person is drawn. So what parts of them is exaggerated. So maybe they have really big eyes, and maybe what that tells the psychologist is, that they might be a little bit, paranoid to some level, right? Or maybe they omitted a body part, and why did they omit a certain body part? So you're trying to figure that out. Or the TAT, which is the thematic apperception test. Now, this test, the TAT, is basically where you're going to tell stories about a drawing or a person in this ambiguous event, and you're asked to just kind of create a story around it, right? It's used to assess motivational states usually. So this is an example of of an ink blot that's commonly shown on the Rorschach. And so, one person might look at this and they say, hey, what do you see? And they say, oh, this is a butterfly, and its wings are ripped and tattered, and it doesn't have very long to live. And another patient or client might sit there and say, this is a butterfly. I don't know what to make of these white spaces. What are these white spaces doing here? I don't know any kind of butterfly with white spots on its wings quite like this. Really, they shouldn't be there, but I guess it's a wing. Maybe they're ripped, right? And what a psychologist might be picking up is, oh, okay, well, one might be, because they kind of were referencing death, they might have this preoccupation with death or pain or something else going on, right? And so, it's kind of a way for you to get into like what is a person's emotional state in that moment to some level. This is an example of the TAT, the thematic apperception test. And again, this is kind of like an ambiguous picture here. We see this man, he's got his hand on this woman's arm as she is, we're not really sure if he's making her sit down or stand up, or is this a fight, or is this like a loving gaze? I don't know, right? And so the idea here is you just show this very ambiguous picture and say, tell me a story, what's happening here? So maybe somebody says, oh, well, this man is being very aggressive with this woman and is holding her arm and making her stay even though she just really wants to leave, right? And maybe there's some control elements that person is dealing with. Or maybe somebody sit there and said, oh, this is just a friend who just wants to get their friend's attention right before she leaves to go to the bathroom, and she's going to come right back, right? I don't know, right? Doesn't matter. The idea here is you're looking for these themes, which is that thematic part of thematic apperception test, right? They're looking for themes within their story that might give them a sense of what that person's internal monologue or dialogue or motivations or unconscious mind is telling them. So with these, there's usually some sort of story or kind of element to it. You're going to ask them for long speeches. This is usually used by clinical psychologists. You generally don't see this too much in research. Sometimes you do, but not too often. A lot of clinical psychologists will use this, and it does provide B data, which again is that behavioral data. So people are taking notes of how you're behaving during this test as well. Now, there's a lot of disadvantages to this, and I'm going to be honest with you. The disadvantages here are pretty significant in that the validity is pretty scarce, meaning validity meaning that are we measuring what we think we're measuring? And because it's so subjective, right? The problem is that we really have a hard time. You got to kind of consider, are we actually measuring personality here? Also, there are a lot of, they take a while. There's a lot of, since there's a lot of storytelling and there's a lot of explaining, these things usually are pretty long. And because of the validity, you can't really be sure of what they mean. So a psychologist really isn't sure quite as much as what it's getting at either. And a lot of people are highly skeptical about these because they're less expensive. There's less expensive options out there, and they work kind of just as much or better a lot of times. And a lot of times people are using them inappropriately. The problem here is that answers might be interpreted differently, right? So one person might hear the story on it, TAT, and say, oh, this person's paranoid, and the other person's like, no, this person is well adjusted, and it's all over the place. But there are some advantages to this. For one, it's actually a really good icebreaker because what it's doing is asking a lot of open-ended questions. And because you're asking a lot of open-ended questions, people start talking more. And it's a little bit not direct. So, if I was to sit there and ask you about your intimate details of your life, you might be very hesitant to tell me because, you're like, I don't know you. How much do I want to tell you? What are the things that I'm okay telling you? What are the things that I want to keep hitting? in this, because you kind of get these ideas flowing, sometimes it's a good icebreaker for people. Also, some skilled clinicians actually can use this in some ways to say, in my opinion, people who answer this way have a tendency towards this, and it might give them a good hypothesis moving forward. So there are some advantages. Now, I will say there's some evidence of validity in the Rorschach and the TAT, but they're valid in predicting certain outcomes, like, for example, suicide, or attendance for treatment sessions, or commitment to mental hospital. So there's some evidence there. But there's little evidence of incremental validity beyond like easier and cheaper tests such as the MMPI. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, I will say that the Rorschach is pretty fondly used. 82% of clinical psychologists have reported using this at some point at least. And it's the fourth most used test, which is saying something because, this is obviously something that people lean on a lot. Now, the best results, for best results, you might want two scorers. What that means is you have two people who are scoring it at the same time, and hopefully they're getting to the same conclusion. So you definitely want multiple people looking at this, and that kind of goes back to like, okay, if we're both saying the same thing, we're not having the same subjective outcome that we're thinking it is. Now, so just kind of keep that in mind. For the TAT, it's supposed to get to your implicit motives. I kind of touched on that. But, there are shorter forms for that one, which is called the picture story exercise. And it's just a short version of it, or shorter version of it. Now, the other type of test is objective tests. And objective tests are going to be, well, what it says is objective. They're going to be more objective and less open to that interpretation as the Inkblot, the Rorschach, and the TAT. So this is going to be more rigid questions. It's a personality test that consists of a list of questions to be answered by the subject as like a yes or no, or a true or false, or maybe on a numeric scale. So it's like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how creative do you feel you are, right? Something like that. So now the items are still not absolutely objective. They can be interpreted in different ways, and this might not be all bad because how they are interpreted might be influenced by the personality, right? So for example, if I was to sit there and ask somebody, how sophisticated do you feel you are? One person might sit there and say, oh, sophisticated, oh, that's well-read and well-educated, and this is a good thing. And somebody might sit there and say sophisticated, oh, that must mean that that they're pretentious or snobby. Oh, I don't identify that with that, right? And so it could still get you to, while that leaves some objectivity open, it can kind of be influenced by your personality and what your motivations are again, right? A good example of an objective test would be the Big Five inventory. And the Big Five basically, there's 5 different traits that they're looking for. They're looking for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And so they're looking at those 5 different traits, and they give a lot of questions to get to that answer. Now, this is definitely built on what we call the principle of aggregation. And so these tests are often very, very long in terms of like how many questions they ask. So for example, the MMPI, that Minnesota one that I was talking about, that one has over 500 questions on it. And the reason we want that many questions is because it's kind of asking, okay, well, what's the average answers over several items? And this way we increase the stability and the reliability of each of these traits to really pinpoint exactly where people are on different spectrums, right? So if I was to say how agreeable you are, which is kind of the how this is how likely you are to say yes to somebody who asks you for help or no, right? So I might ask you in a variety of different ways, and we see, okay, this person is consistently answering in certain ways or not. Or we might say, hey, this person's kind of in the middle. It really depends on the situation if they're going to say yes or no. Or they're like, no, this person's consistently saying no every time, right? Um, and so this principle of aggregation is about getting so many questions, throwing so many questions out there that hopefully we get this stability that happens over the course of those questions. And the way we calculate this, I think we talked about this last week, is by using the Spearman-Brown formula. You're not going to need to know that. This isn't a stats class. But basically, it's a statistical analysis to figure out, hey, do you need more questions or not? Now, for objective tests, what's the rationale? Well, it's based off of on a theory, but basically rational method. We're going to be using what we call the rational method, and this type of theory is basically, hey, we're going to write answers or write items that are directly and obviously and rationally related to what is measured. So we're like kind of just asking really direct questions a lot of times when we use the rational method, when we're constructing an objective test. So rational method of construction would be like, hey, we're just going to ask you straight up, how open are you? Hey, we're going to ask you straight, how easy is it for you to handle a stressful situation with your emotions, right? Those are very direct questions. And it's like you can kind of get a sense of what we're asking just from that question. I mean, just by me asking how open you are, I'm asking you exactly how open are you? If I'm asking you, how able are you to control your emotions in a stressful environment, you might get a sense of, hey, this person might be asking me, how even keeled I am, how easygoing I am, right? And so they're very obvious and direct in a lot of these ways. So there's 4 different types of validity when we're looking at this, because when we're constructing these, we need to meet all 4 conditions of validity in order for it to be rational. So the first one is that the items mean the same to the test taker and the creator. So we want a question where there's no question exactly what we're asking. If I ask you and I ask the next person and I ask me and I ask the next person, all of us are going to say, oh, this means blank, and we're all going to have the same answer, right? So if I was going back to the sophisticated example, right? My definition of sophisticated is the same as yours. So we need items that are going to be the same no matter who's taking it. So that's 1. 2, we're going to need it. The person who's taking it's going to have the capability of having that accurate self-assessment, right? So if I ask somebody, how giving are you, right? Maybe the person who's giving is also very humble. It's like, okay, well, I'm not going to tell you that I'm super giving, and that's maybe they really don't feel like they're that giving because that's so normal to them. But you have to have this capability of looking at yourself and saying, actually, maybe I am a really giving person, or I'm not a very giving person. But that accurate reflection needs to happen. Also, you're going to need a willingness to make an accurate and undistorted report, and this has to do with the person constructing it. So it's tempting, if you're creating a test, to really get to the heart of what you want it to test for. And that can be tempting to sway questions in a way that is going to be not very beneficial in the end. What do I mean by that? Well, if I was to sit there and ask you guys, on a scale of 1 to 10, how amazing is Professor Blake, me, right? Let's say that you're like, oh, I love this class. It's going great. I love that it's online and asynchronous. I like that he has the narrated slides. It's a 10 out of 10 for me, dude, right? And that's great. But let's say that you're at the opposite end. You're like, oh, I hate this. I hate listening to his voice. I hate the online format. I learn better, in person. I hate using online books. I'd rather it be like a physical book too, whatever it might be, right? And I'm kind of in that wheelhouse too, where I'm like, oh, I prefer books. So, right, let's say that I'm that person. I might say a one, but what does a one mean in that way? It means that think that it's, if the original question is how awesome is Professor Blake's class, and I say it's a one, well, then I can sit there and say, well, obviously this person, only a little bit enjoys the class. When the real answer is, I don't enjoy it at all, right? And so, you have to be willing to make these accurate and undistorted reports with your questions that allow people to answer accurately. So, and lastly, items need to be valid indicators of what they're measuring. Basically meaning that when we're looking at something, it needs to be what we're actually looking at, that we're testing, right? We want to make sure that if we're testing, let's say that we're testing creativity, well, then all the measures on there should be measuring what creativity is, right? And not things that might be associated with creativity but aren't, right? So maybe it's openness, right? Which a lot of times people that are creative are very open. But in this case, open is not necessarily creative. And so, you want to make sure that the measures are indicative of the thing that you're actually trying to measure. Yeah. Now, this is actually the most common form of test construction, this rational method. But we can also use other types. So, for example, the factor analysis. Now, this is another statistical way of analyzing things. I'm not going to make you know how to do it, but I do want you to know what it does. And so factor analysis is a technique that it identifies groups of things that seem to have something in common, right? And so what would this look like? So, for example, let's say that there's a forest, and in the forest there's lots of trees, right? And you start looking at all these trees, and you start noticing that the different colors and the different shapes of these trees, and the different shapes of the leaves on these trees. And what you start to realize is, hey, certain trees are very similar to each other. And so you start gathering all this information together, and you start saying, well, instead of just a tree, this type of tree, because of the color and the shape of the leaves, and different identifiable markers, we're going to start calling this an oak tree. And this tree over here is very different than the oak tree. This tree, instead of growing in the forest, this one grows near oceans, and it seems to have the leaves are very kind of more rigid but very big, and they seem to grow these balls. And if you open these balls, they have this meat and this water in it, and we're going to call these coconut trees, right? So we start to identify these different factors, right? And so what we need to do this is we need to generate a long list of objective items in terms of like personality, a lot of objective questions, and then we administer these to a large number of people. We're going to give this to a large number of people, and we're going to analyze, based on these people, what kind of groups are we starting to identify? Hey, these people tend to answer in this way, and they tend to not be very social. Maybe they're more introverted, and these types of people over here, they answered in this way, which is more on the neuroticism, which is how likely they are to be able to handle their emotions, and they answered this way. And so you start grouping people together like that. So the factor analytic method is just it identifies which groups together using that factor analysis. So things like we can look at narcissism and antisocial traits, and whatever it is. So that's a different type of method outside of just that rational, the one that I just talked on. So if you're still kind of confused, hopefully this will help illustrate a little bit more. So let's say that we're looking for how warm a person is, so how caring and loving a person is, right? And we give them a bunch of different tests, right? So what we might find is that people that are warm, right, the people that we've identified as this warm person, might answer in very particular patterns. So we might ask people, I trust strangers, and I am careful to turn up when someone expects me, or I could stand being a hermit, right? So if a person is saying true to this question and true to this question, but false to this question, and they consistently, these people that we've identified as warm, are consistently answering true, true, false to these questions, then we can start to really get a sense of, oh, okay, if we see these patterns, it's a marker of, oh, this person is probably very warm. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, we can also do what's called the empirical method, which identifies items based on how people in pre-identified groups respond. So the way that this works is basically we are going to gather a lot of items again, but we're going to have a sample of people already divided into groups. Right? So we've already divided people into groups. We're going to administer the test, and then we're going to compare them to different groups. So let's say that the MMPI does this with what we call like antisocial personality or narcissism ones. So let's take narcissism, for example. So what they have done is they basically said, hey, we've had these group of people who we've identified as narcissists. We're going to have these people take the test, and if they've marked as the same pattern as the narcissist groups, then we're going to compare those, right? So we're going to compare the answers of different groups. The basic assumption is that certain kinds of people have distinct ways of answering certain questions. If people diagnosed with depression answer a certain group of questions differently than everybody else, then those items might form like what we call a depression scale. So therefore, new participants who answer the questions the same way as people diagnosed with depression, they would score high on the scale, and you might suspect that they are too depressed, right? So again, the MMPI, which is like a prototypical example of this method, was built using this strategy. And what this leads to is what we call cross-validation, which is basically where you're just kind of validating yourself through the testing of new people. You're basically saying, hey, we've identified somebody that was really high on this depression scale. Hey, let's check to see if they're depressed. Oh yeah, they're depressed. Great. That validates that we have a good, strong scale for depression, if that makes sense. Now, we can also use a combination of these methods, and times they do use this. So we can generate like rational questions through the rational method, where we ask very direct ones. We can analyze those with the factor analysis, where we then start to figure out, okay, what are the patterns of answering these rational methods? And then we can correlate these factors, meaning we try to find a relationship between these factors to identify certain patterns or scales, right? And then we combine all of those together. So then how do we go about testing to make sure that this is a really strong, basically, well, for lack of better words, we're trying to find how is the test actually really good test to give out, and is it not just going to be by chance that we find different things? Well, a lot of times they use basically what we call the null hypothesis significance testing, or the NHST. This is basically a very, very, probably the most common or the most widely known way of doing hypothesis testing. But basically what we're looking for is some sort of statistical significance, where basically when we find something through our stats, we're looking for, did it occur by chance of less than 5%? And what we do is we basically create two hypotheses. We have what we call a null hypothesis, which basically means that nothing's happening, and we have our experimental hypothesis, which basically means that we think that this is going to be the outcome by doing this experiment or by doing this statistical analysis, right? Now, again, we're not going to go into the actual statistics here, but with null hypothesis significant testing, we're looking for what we call a p-value. And that p-value is basically the probability level of obtaining a result from a statistical test if there's no difference between the groups or no relationship between the variables. Meaning that we're looking at multiple groups and we're saying, is there a difference between these groups? So we might have one group that we've identified as being open. We might find another group that we, that we just get off the streets and are just random sampled, and we'll compare them and say, hey, is there a difference between these groups, is really what we're asking there. And so the null hypothesis is the possibility that there's a zero result, and we're trying to disprove the null hypothesis. So we're trying to say no to the null hypothesis in that there is a difference between these groups, right? So we use this type of test a lot. However, a lot of people are highly critical of this method. They don't like this method very much. In fact, some people will, instead of calling it the NHST, they might call it the SHNT. And I'll let you kind of sound it out to know exactly what that means, but I'll leave that to you. But this is really the most common form of it. So what are the problems with this? Well, one is that it's really arbitrary in a lot of ways. Because we're saying, hey, we're leaving a 5% chance probability that, our results are just happening by chance. And this is kind of, it's like, well, why? And the best definition that anybody can give is, I don't know, because that's what we do, right? And so people are like, oh, that seems so silly because there's no reason to it. But that's just kind of what the scientific community has decided. The other problem with this is that a lot of times, just because you don't hit that 0.05 threshold or the 5% threshold, right, doesn't mean that you don't have something there. So actually, sometimes you might see some people, instead of doing a 5%, they might do a 10%, because there still might be a difference. It just might not be the same impact or the same effect as the 0.05. And so it still might be significant, or there might be a difference in the groups. It just, it didn't meet that 0.05 threshold. The other problem is that it only accounts for a type 1 error. And if you remember back to your research methods days or your statistics days, type 1 error is deciding that one variable has an effect on or a relationship with another variable when really it doesn't. So in other words, you think something's happening, but really it's not happening, right? So this would be what we call a false positive. You're thinking something actually is occurring when really it's not. And so it's hypersensitive to type 1 errors, but it's actually not very good at detecting type 2 errors, which is the opposite. This is a false negative. It's so you're saying nothing's happening, but really something is happening. So there is a difference between the groups, but you didn't catch it. So that's another issue with this. Some people think that there's more meaning behind gathering what we call an effect size, and we can kind of determine an effect size by using what the most common ones, the correlation coefficient. Sometimes people will use like the Pearson's R, right? That's really the most common one, and this is a correlational study. Actually, you can use it for correlations mostly, but you can use it for experiments as well. Now, effect size is an index of magnitude, or basically strength. So we're looking at the strength of a relationship between variables. So how strong of a relationship are there? Is it a really, really strong relationship where it's like when one thing's happen, so let's say that if I take, let's say that I take the, let's say I take a, what's it called? A painkiller. If I take this painkiller, then I definitely won't feel pain afterwards, right? That would be a very strong one. So if I take this pill, all of my pain is gone. That's a really strong effect. Or is it that I take this painkiller and it just miles it out a little bit, right? That's not very strong, right? But it did help. It just wasn't as strong, right? So that's like the strength in terms of what I mean by that. So I have two pills, one that's like I take it and I feel absolutely no pain, and that's like, ooh, that's a strong relationship. Or if I take a pill and it's like, oh, I took the edge off, but I still feel a lot of pain. Okay, the relationship between those may be a little bit less, right? So that's kind of what I mean by effect size there. Now we calculate this, and it's always, whenever we calculate this, it's usually going to be, well, it produces what we call an R value, but our R value is always going to fall between -1 and 1. And if it's at a 0, which is in the very, very middle, it basically means that there's no relationship there. This would be like me taking a pill for pain and no pain goes away, right? There's no relationship. I took this pill, no pain went away. All right, there's no relationship between that pill and my pain, right? So there's no relationship. So that would be a 0. As we get closer to -1 and 1, that shows us the strength of it. You can ignore for just a second the negative and positive part of that, but if as it gets closer to 1, either -1 or 1, you know it's a very strong relationship. Now the positive and negative tells you the relationship type. So that tells you what kind of relationship. So here we have we usually disseminate this with like scatter plots, where we have one variable measured on one axis and we have another variable measured on this axis right here. So let's say, for example, that I want to measure how much sleep you got versus how happy you are today, right? And so you say, I go to one person, I say, hey, how much sleep did you get? And they're like, oh, I got 2 hours of sleep. And you say, okay, well, how satisfied are you, or how happy are you today? Oh man, well, I'm kind of like a 4 in happiness. So then their dot would be here, and you go to another person, you just keep repeating that, and you get a bunch of different spots, and each person is their own spot essentially. So we might find that these dots start forming a pattern if we start finding that there's some sort of relationship between those two variables. So let's say that it's the case that the more sleep you get, the more happy you are. So that might look more closer to this side right here. So, okay, I didn't get a lot of sleep. I'm not very happy right here, right? Or I got a lot of sleep. Oh, I am so happy, right? So there, right? So as it gets closer to the outsides of this kind of axis, I guess. What do you want to call it? As you get to the outside, you're going to notice that there's patterns that are forming. But as you get closer to 0, where there's no relationship, then it's all over the place, right? So now when it comes to terms of like, okay, well, how does this matter for personality assessments? Well, a lot of times we're trying to measure lots of different things about certain personalities. So we might say, we might be asking about each question. So, hey, how if I think this is a question that answers openness, if they score a 7 on this openness question, and then they score an openness, they score a 7 on this openness question, then we okay, maybe this is a good kind of questions to link together, right? So that's kind of one way of doing it. We could also link them together with like different types of traits or personalities or types, right? We say, okay, if you're likely to be high in depression, you might be high in anxiety too, and you can start linking them that way too. So we use these a lot of times for prediction methods. That's why we use these. And we do calculate them for experimental studies as well. Now, one way of doing this is through what we call R squared, or the coefficient of determination. You might have remembered that from a past stat class. And the book basically says that this is a pretty terrible way of evaluating effect size by doing that kind of calculation. So what kind of calculation does personality inventories usually do, or personality assessments usually do? Well, really what we do is a lot of BESDs, or binomial effect size display. And so this is a concrete display of what a correlation means in terms of specific outcomes. This is just one method of displaying and understanding more clearly the magnitude, again, that's the strength of an effect reported as a correlation. And so let me give you an example. Let's say that we assume you have 200 participants and we have 102 different groups. So we have 200 total. We've separated them into two groups. So we're going to have 100 people in each group. So we're trying to test a drug and we want to figure out, okay, is this drug worth taking for people? So we get an R, which is our Pearson's R, of 0.00, which again means that there's absolutely no effect. And quite frankly, if we look at this, it makes sense why this is a no effect, because the people that took the drug, this is the 100 people right here that took the drug. Oops, didn't mean to do that. You have the 100 people that took the drug. 50 of them lived, 50 of them died. Then you have, this is the no drugged group. 50 of them lived, 50 of them died. And so that's basically, you're having 100 people that are living and 100 people that are dying. Is it worth taking the drug? Probably not, because it's no different. Now, look at this one though. This way is looking at the BESD, right? So the binomial effect size. And so in this case, this one got an R of 0.4. So what this looks like is, okay, well, first off, 0.4 is kind of a weak effect. So you might say, well, why would I take this drug? It's a pretty weak effect, right? Well, let's look at the numbers. And if this is talking about life and death, consider that, right? So 0.4, not the strongest relationship, but you might be like, I don't want to take the drug if it's only 0.4. Well, let's look at the numbers. So you have 100 people in the group that took the drug. And we end up, basically what you do is you take your R, which is 0.4, times it by 100, divided by 2. But then you're comparing it by the percentage chance of it being in each of these categories, which is, in this case, is 50 people can be here, 50 people can be there, right? And we find that when the people took the drug, 70 people who took the drug lived, and then 30 died. And then the people that didn't take the drug, 30 lived, and 70 died. So realistically, here, you have 40 more people in the group that took the drug that lived. And when we're talking about life and death, it's like, well, yeah, it might be only a moderate effect size, but this is pretty significant to the point where it's like, I'd rather take the drug here, right? If that makes sense. So that's kind of how they assess for this. So we're going to get more into some of the ethics part of this. And a lot of times you have to ask the question of like, how dependable is each of these assessments, or what's a replication, right? So replication being doing the study again to see if you find the same result with different participants and in different labs, right? So you're trying to see, okay, if I replicate this study, do I get the same result? There was a pretty famous study from Ioannidis, and Ioannidis basically produced a study that basically found that most published research findings are actually false, which is pretty crazy to think about. And the reason that this person stated that, Ioannidis stated this, is that many studies have weak effects, right? Which we just talked about, like 0.3, 0.4, right? And you're like, oh, that's pretty weak, right? And so you got to kind of keep in mind that a lot of these will use not that many people, because I will say about the study is it specifically was talking about biomedicine more than other types of research. But in biomedicine, it is pretty common. And think of it this way. Sometimes you don't have access to a lot of people to do these types of studies on. Like, if it's a rare genetic disease and you want to do study, but there's only about 1,000 people that are in the world that have this type of disease, it's like, okay, well, hopefully you can get all the 1,000 people to do it, but a lot of times you're looking at like 5 to 10 that you have access to, right? So you might find a weak effect size. Also, there's kind of some, you have to remember that when people publish their work, um, they get rewarded for interesting findings. And so, even though it's important to also research kind of the stuff that might be less interesting, it's actually pretty important. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that there's something called the publication bias. So studies with strong results are more likely to be published than studies with weak results, leading to published literature to make effects seem stronger than they actually are, because all of a sudden you're getting, oh, all of these things are so interesting, right? So I think, for example, there was a study that was out once that said that eating chocolate actually made us lose weight. And that, first off, nutrition is a wildly controversial science right now. Um, but is it that, is it true that that's the case? It's like, well, it's a weak effect, but it's an interesting study, so therefore we're going to publish it. And that can really confuse people, especially the general public, because they're sitting there saying, well, I'm just going to eat all the chocolate and I'm going to lose all the weight. It's like, well, maybe, but likely there's more to the story than that. Or maybe this is one of the ones that was that fell for that 5%, percentage threshold that we were talking about earlier, right? So it's possible that there's a lot of different things happening there. So, the main idea here is that really we need things to be replicable. And if they're not replicable, if we're not able to reproduce it, then that's a problem. Another problem is that, kind of along the same vein, is a lot of researchers know that if they don't get an interesting result, then they can't publish their work. And that's a problem because it leads to questionable research practices. So people might leave things out of their data set, or they might do something called p-hacking, which is basically where you hack around in one's data. So you just keep looking into your data until you find a kind of necessary degree of statistical significance that allows you to then be published. So you're basically like kind of going through your research and selectively picking and saying, oh, look, I've selectively picked it and now I've found the result I'm looking for, or something interesting at least. And that's not really ideal, but really it's incentivized in a lot of ways. Researchers are often looked at by how many articles they produced of research, and that's not great. Also, a lot of times we don't really reproduce, and we should be, but a lot of times we don't, because, well, if I reproduce something that somebody else did, right, I'm not going to get published because they already got published for it. So why is that interesting? If I'm a journal article, I may not actually produce it. And that's a problem too. Now, this can lead to other things, such as, so Bem had an article about precognition. And so precognition is like reacting to the stimulus before it's actually presented, right? And we don't actually have precognition, but this person had found that there was precognition. We've never been able to reproduce that. And so, but that article's still out there because it was published, right? And it's kind of like, think in terms of like social media. When somebody posts something on social media that they wish they didn't, it's like, well, it's out there forever, even if you don't want it to be anymore, right? And so, you might be, looked at differently. So let's say that you were really frustrated one day, and you went on to your social media and said, oh, I really hate my significant other. He's a real jerk. He or she's a real jerk, or they're a real jerk, and they did X, Y, Z, and you sent it out, and now everybody thinks of that person really poorly, but you still want to have that relationship with them, but now you're fighting against everybody's kind of what they thought about that. It's kind of similar here. It's like, well, we produce this, and then you go, oh, maybe we made a mistake, and you can't dial back time. A lot of times data can be faked. That's also a problem. Think in terms of, like, I hate to say this, but if where are the funding coming? So let's say that, like, you have a billion-dollar industry that's producing research. It's like, well, you might be incentivized. Some people might be incentivized so that they can keep their job to get the results that the company wants them to. I'm not saying that this happens everywhere, but I will say that it's out there. So, how do we make things more dependable? Well, first off, try as much as you can to get a large number of participants. We want, especially with these personality inventories, we want to use this on as many people as possible because the larger numbers, it means that we have a better understanding. So we want to have large numbers of participants. We also want to disclose all our methods. So whether we get published or not, we still want our methods to be out there so that people can reproduce it if they want it to. And we want to be able to share that data. So we don't want to put it under lock and key. We want it to be kind of open source where people can use it. Also, we want to report studies that don't work because it's actually just as important that we know what isn't working, because that tells us, hey, don't go up this, maybe we don't go over here, right? Or that it's been done before, rather than only producing work that has produced results. Okay? And also, the best thing to do is, if you read one study, don't look at it as this is proof for anything. First off, when it comes to science doesn't prove anything. It only disproves. And so that's really important for us to know, mainly because you can't really prove anything. It takes one piece of evidence to refute everything that we know. But we don't want to just read one piece of information and just draw large conclusions from it. So that's important as well. So going back to like what's the purpose of doing personality testing, there's different uses for it. One is that we can learn things about people, and that's what a lot of researchers and government agencies will do, just to kind of get a sense of like what are types of people and what are they like and what can we learn from that. But we also have helping people too. So, if you're seeing a counselor, they might do it to see, hey, what are some of the patterns that we're seeing here that might be harmful for you or might be a benefit to you that we can kind of lean into and really get you to be successful because this is the strength of you. So it could be for helping people, and it could be, unfortunately, also for selection or retention of employment. Like the CIA uses tests to select agents, right? And so it might be a way for them to identify who they want. Although that's kind of a double-edged sword too, right? Because they might have an idea of what they think they want in their head, and that might not actually be the most beneficial for the agency, right? So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. But there are some arguments for and against it. For example, it provides valuable information to people who may not know what they want to do. So let's say that you take a personality inventory and you're talking to a career counselor. They might say, hey, here's your strengths. This type of pattern of personality would really do good in this type of field. And maybe it's worth investigating for yourself, right? Like, for example, I know that ENTPs, which is like extroverted neuroticism, thinking perceivers, which is part of the Myers-Briggs, which has its own kind of limitations. But the Myers-Briggs ENTPs often are what we call the debaters. And those are going to be people who are really more interested in debating formats, right? So they might be good lawyers and attorneys, or they might be good CEOs, right? Or maybe even professors, right? Something like that. And so it could give you a sense of where to go. But to the same effect, it may handcuff people because they might sit there and say, these are what you are going to be good at. Go do this only, right? And that's not really great. Also, tests can be kind of unfair mechanisms for controlling people. That can be in terms of okay, so we've identified somebody who is high in narcissism. It's okay, what are we going to do about that person? Well, maybe we put a high surveillance on them because they're flagged for some not great tendencies, right? Well, that's not really great if they haven't done anything. So that's another problem. And traits don't really matter until or unless they are tested, right? So maybe you didn't even really care about this stuff until you learned about it, and then all of a sudden now you care about it to a really high degree. So that's a problem. The other issue is that it's a lot of reductionism, right? People are very complex, and even if we reduce you down to a few traits that you tend to gravitate towards, that doesn't really give us the whole picture of a person, and so that's not really fair as well. And so in some ways, it's kind of undignified and degrading because it's basically saying this is who you are on a number of traits, and this is all you can be, and that's not really ideal either. Now, a good psychologists would basically say this is only for helping purposes, and this is not the whole picture. But it's easy to fall into the trap of saying this is who you are, and this is who I'm always going to see you as. And so, the responses to those problems. Well, some people think that they're kind of those criticisms are naive, and that it makes sense to use personality tests as a basis of making important decisions because it's objective, right? A lot of these are objective tests, and look, people are gonna judge us no matter what, so we would like to have objective ways over subjective ways so that we can eliminate some of the stereotypes and some of the prejudiceness that comes with our own criticisms or judgments of others. So, personality will be judged in some ways, and tests are likely to be more valid than judgments. So, that's some of the reasons against it. Now, when we do these things, I want you to know that whenever you do any type of study, you have to go through what's called an IRB, or an institutional review board. And what we're doing is, we're concerned about the consequences of what we're doing with participants, and so IRBs are going to look at those. And so, for example, some famous studies like the Milgram's obedience studies, or the Zimbardo's prison study, those were very ethically, let's say, for lack of a better words, gray at best. And so we have IRBs that must approve our research done by university scientists. And so what they do is they basically say, hey, if we are going to have to put somebody through a study, it needs to be worth it, right? And so we're not saying you can't do things like deceive people, right? Because sometimes you need to deceive people. If I was to walk up to you and say, hey, I want you to participate in this test that's going to look at, how my dress and attire impacts how much you listen to me, right? Before you do the test, then you already kind of know what I'm looking for, and you can act however you want to. However, if I deceive you, you're going to be more genuine in how you present yourself. And so some level of deception is needed, but it needs to be allowed by the APA guidelines. So meaning that you have to add extra justification as to why we're doing the deception and why it's necessary, and is the things that we learn from it going to outweigh the downsides of deceiving people. And the other issue has to do with privacy. So making sure that when we are collecting this behavioral data, or when we're collecting this S data, we want to make sure that everything stays private too. So we a lot of times with these, there's a lot of protections and kind of red tape that's designed to be for the betterment of our society. And this is just generally good things for everybody to do. But realistically, we want to be open and honest with our science. We want to, create original data. We're going to want to report it accordingly. We're going to want to describe as much as we can, not hide things. Open source is like a set of practices which is intended to move research closer to ideals on which science was founded, like the emerging remedy for incomplete reporting. And so having more of this open source is probably ideal, and that's another issue that we constantly trying to uphold. So in conclusion, personality tests are one of the most important applications of our personality research. Researchers should ask themselves two questions. Why am I doing this, and are they for good reasons? That's ethical concerns. And citizens should keep close watch on the activities of other organizations and individuals. So that's what we got for this week. Hopefully you've learned something or enjoyed something. And if you have questions, please, please, please send me an email or reach out, and I will be happy to answer them as fast as I can. With that, enjoy your week.